Scottish nationalists want another shot at independence. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon announces plans to hold a second referendum, but can she legally hold a vote? And can she win? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Scotland. The 2014 Scottish independence referendum was hailed as a once-in-a-generation vote. But just less than a decade later, Nicola Sturgeon wants to try again. The First Minister has been paving the way for a second vote for some time, but last week was the starkest indication of just how badly she wants it. Speaking to the Scottish Parliament, Sturgeon said she was formally writing to British Prime Minister Boris Johnson to seek consent, and then announced she'd already set the date.
Presiding Officer, I can announce that the Scottish Government is proposing that the independence referendum be held on the 19th of October 2023.
Well, after Brexit forced Scotland to leave the European Union in 2016, calls for a second independence vote got louder. While the UK as a whole voted to leave the EU, more than 60% of Scots voted to remain. But getting official consent for another referendum won't be straightforward. Boris Johnson has made it clear he will not give the go-ahead, arguing another vote shouldn't take place for at least 40 years. And during the NATO summit in Madrid, his defense minister, Ben Wallace, had some choice words for the Scottish First Minister.
They had the referendum, they lost the referendum, and instead of then saying, OK, hands up, let's try and see if there's a better way, let's try and better the people of Scotland's experience with public services, she's just banged on the same one-trick pony.
Sturgeon will likely have to go to the Supreme Court for permission, and even that may not go her way. But if things do fall into place, would a second vote yield a different result? In 2014, 3.6 million people voted on whether or not Scotland should be an independent country. Just under 45% said yes. That's about 1.6 million ballots. While more than 2 million, about 55%, voted to remain in the United Kingdom. Well, opinion polls show if a vote were held right now, it could go either way. According to one survey conducted for the Scotsman newspaper, 46% said they'd vote to remain, and 44% say they'll vote for independence. But crucially, 1 in 10 of those asked was still undecided. But these protesters are certain of what they want. Last month, thousands marched through Glasgow demanding independence, not just from Westminster, but from Boris Johnson too.
Boris Johnson is a liar and he needs to go. But also we're proving that we need to have independence to get away from Westminster. To get away from Westminster, get away from Boris Johnson and any of Westminster's control of Scotland.
So should Scotland be an independent country? Scottish voters said no once, but will they change their mind if they get a vote in 2023? Joining me now to debate that are from Strichen, Scotland, Scotland's former First Minister, Alex Salmond. He is now the founder and leader of the Alba Party. John Niccolson is in London. He's a member of Parliament for the Scottish National Party. And from People's Scotland is John Ferry. He's the financial spokesperson for the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Thanks all so much for being with us. Alex, let me start with you. Boris Johnson will say no, but the Supreme Court could say yes. Is your gut telling you that you'll be voting again in October of next year?
Well, that's the date that's been more than penciled in, promised by the Scottish government. So I've certainly got a circle round it in my diary. I'm certainly hoping that's the case. I wouldn't give, I mean, Boris Johnson will certainly say no, but I wouldn't give up on the idea of campaigning to change his mind. I mean, he's a very weak prime minister. He's going to fall from office at some point over the next few months. I'd have thought a determined Scottish campaign at parliamentary level, at demonstration level, at diplomatic level, would have every chance of changing Boris Johnson's mind and toppling him over. I think it's a question of political pressure. As far as the Supreme Court's concerned, I don't hold out any great hopes there. I think the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom is not going to be friendly to Scottish aspirations. And then it would go to, according to the First Minister, my successor, it'll go to a general election in Scotland. But I'm certainly got that date of October next year ring-fenced in my diary, and I'll be looking forward to the referendum delivered and another chance to vote on Scottish independence.
Fair enough. John Nicholson, is that a realistic scenario being described there?
Well, it all depends, doesn't it, on whether we're in a voluntary or an involuntary union. The United Kingdom is meant to be a voluntary union. That's something that all politicians agree on. Something else that all politicians agreed on at the last Scottish elections was that if there was a majority returned to the Scottish Parliament in favour of a referendum, then we would have a referendum. The Lib Dems said that, the Tories and the Labour Party said that, as well as the SNP. So there's no reason not to have a referendum. I have absolutely no problem whatsoever with people like John here campaigning against Scottish independence. But what John doesn't have the right to do, what no one, including Boris Johnson, doesn't have the right to do, is prevent Scots from voting on their own future, because that's our right as a country to decide whether we want to be in the United Kingdom or whether we want to be independent.
Fair enough. John Ferry, I want to move forward and just assume there is another vote. What do you want Scots to understand about the consequences, then, of leaving the UK?
Hi, Andrea. Thank you for having me. Let me just correct something that John Nicholson just said. That he said that all the parties agreed that if there was a majority of SNP or nationalist MSPs returned after the last Holyrood election, that there would be a referendum. That is not the case. And this actually gets to the heart of one of the fundamental problems of why we actually don't want there to be another referendum. It is a perfect platform for misinformation and lies from those who will try to say anything just to get this over the line and then worry about the consequences later. We saw that also with Brexit, with things like £350 million on the side of a bus. And then, of course, that turned out to be complete nonsense. So this is a kind of a tried and tested tactic from those who want to gain separation from unions, that they will say anything, do anything to get their stated policy over the line and worry about the consequences later, by which time the people who actually hurt and whose lives are turned upside down by those policies, it's too late for them to do anything about it. So we have to be very careful of that, very careful of misinformation, twisting of facts to the points of misinformation, which Mr. John Nicholson just did there. To your other point as to the actual consequence, let me finish my point, John. To your other point as to the actual consequence of independence actually happening, it is clear when we look at this, when we take an evidence-based, rational approach to the policy of separating off Scotland's economy from its existing national economic base, that it would be not in the interest of the people of Scotland, not in their welfare interest, and not actually, ironically, in the Scottish national interest for that to happen. When we actually talk to professional economists in particular on this, and when we have them analyse the situation, and they look at the consequences of Scotland sometime in 2025, cutting itself off overnight from its treasury and its established currency base, from its treasury and its established tax base, from its central bank and its established currency base, from its welfare state, and etc., etc. The consequences of that economically are so profound that they would impact people's lives so negatively. It would create poverty where it currently doesn't exist. It would make poverty worse where it currently does exist. It would create a plethora of problems for our society that we would take decades to recover from. Okay. And I do not want to see people of Scotland go through that. And that's why people like me are standing firm against people like Alex Salmond and John Nicholson, who really want this to happen.
Okay, John Nicholson, we can go back to the first part of John Ferry's answer there, because I could see you weren't exactly on the same page about this campaign being so vulnerable to misinformation and lies, as John Ferry says Brexit actually was. Why would this campaign be different? Even from people talking about Russian interference as a means to try and break up the European Union and the UK, cause more turmoil. What do you say to that?
Well, of course, the last thing that the Russians want under Vladimir Putin is for small independent countries to declare their independence and join NATO as Scotland would, and join the European Union as Scotland would. I love the Lib Dems name because they're neither very liberal these days, grand old party, nor very democratic. And of course, it's a matter of record that at the time of the last Scottish elections, politicians from the Unionist camp, including the leader of the opposition, the Conservative, said, if you go out today and if you vote for the SNP or the Greens, you're voting for a referendum. They all said it. Now, the biggest risk to Scots' economic well-being is Brexit. We're seeing the results of that every day. And it was the Lib Dems, of course, under their former leader, Nick Clegg, who first introduced the idea that there should be a Brexit referendum. They campaigned very hard for that, and it is as disastrous as we all knew that it would be. So what I want for Scotland is for us to have a civilised debate. John's absolutely right. There should be no disinformation. We should all argue our case respectfully. But crucially, that case should be put to the Scottish electorate. I'm not scared of what Scots will say if they're given the chance to decide. But the only one of us in this debate who wants to prevent the Scots from having a say is my Liberal Democrat colleague here, John. The rest of us want Scots to have their say. Let them have their say. Let the people decide.
Okay.
Andrea, can I take on that democracy point just before Alex comes back? And I know you'll be dying to talk.
Yes, quickly, please.
But it is not the case in any of the world's democracies that a minority nationalist party that happens to gain control of a devolved sub-state legislature after a parliamentary election by hooking up with another minority nationalist party. It is not the case that in that case the collective nationalist parties get to rewrite the constitution of the state. That is not democracy, John. That's not how democracy actually works, because constitutions and the rule of law are a fundamental cornerstone of democracy. And when you look at these things, you get around, you get over. You disrespect democracy, you disrespect the people of Scotland who fought for devolution.
Can I suggest?
Yeah, I want to give equal time to everybody. Alex, I know you had a comment. Do go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think John from the Liberals gave that away when he talked about Scotland as a sub-state. The vast majority of people in Scotland regard Scotland as a nation, and a nation with the right of self-determination. We are meant to be in a voluntary union with England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, part of Northern Ireland. Nobody has suggested hitherto that it's an involuntary union. Now, if it's a voluntary union and Scotland is a nation with the right of self-determination, then the people of Scotland must have the democratic means of judging this issue again. In fact, judging it when they want to judge it. And by any comparison, under a proportional system, people last year voted to have a referendum on Scottish independence. That is their right to do so. Now, there's very point that's important, which is well beyond politics. I mean, Scottish nationalism, the cause and argument for Scottish independence, it's not unique in the world, but it's certainly unusual in the world. And it's always been pursued since its inception on an entirely democratic, peaceful, constitutional basis. But that, of course, is because people have had democratic roots, either a majority of members of parliament or since the inception of the Scottish Parliament, a majority of MSPs leading to a referendum, an agreed referendum. Now, if David Cameron, the Tory Prime Minister, agreed with me in 2012, that was the sensible democratic route to look at this issue, to allow the people of Scotland to judge, then why shouldn't Boris Johnson, a Tory Prime Minister, respond in a similarly democratic manner? Now, I think the people in the Liberal Democrats, the Tories, Labour, the Unionist parties, heavily underrate the anger there is among ordinary people in Scotland who see what they democratically voted for last year being undemocratically refused this year by Unionist parties. And I think it really would be better to get off this mechanism, to agree that Scots have the right to decide as a nation, and then John from the Liberals can put his arguments as he wishes in a referendum campaign. One last point. I do agree with John Nicholson that it's a bit rich for the Liberal Democrats to start saying they're opposed to referendum. It was indeed Nick Clegg and the Liberal Democrats who first ever suggested that there should be a referendum on Europe. Now, if it's not to be a referendum, then there has to be another democratic means, which brings us back to it being decided at a general election. But one way or another, Scots as a nation are entitled to have their say.
Okay, I want to move it forward and actually talk about the potential consequences of a stay or leave vote and what Scots in particular have to gain financially. We have three main areas. We have trade, travel, and currency. Efforts, of course, we're being told will be made to rejoin the European Union, but that also means then new trade barriers with the UK will have to go up. John Nicholson, which is worse, the EU border or a new UK border for Scotland's economy?
Well, that's a slightly negative way of asking the question.
But you technically you can't have both.
As you'll know, the EU is infinitely flexible. The sort of arrangement that Northern Ireland has, which has benefited the Northern Irish economy since Brexit under the protocol, which is something that Boris Johnson is trying to destroy at the moment, gave Northern Ireland the best of both worlds. It was both a member of the European Union through its relationship with Southern Ireland, and it also had free movement. At least that was the plan, free movement throughout the United Kingdom. But the majority, of course, of countries that are members of the European Union were once part of larger countries. Very few borders have remained unmoved in the European Union. From Finland, Estonia, Latvia through to Ireland, most countries in the European Union have split away from a bigger power block. But what interests me about John's argument is he tells us all the things that we cannot have. But as a Democrat, can he tell us if he doesn't believe in the mandate that was given to the SNP and Greens at the last election, if he no longer believes in referendums, apparently, if he doesn't believe that a general election provides a mandate, is the United Kingdom still a voluntary union? And if so, how can Scotland leave? Could he tell us that?
Okay, John. Ferry, go ahead and respond.
Well, that's a particular type of framing which obviously suits John Nicholson's way of debating here. If you look at any Western democracy, it is perfectly normal for those countries, parts of those countries, whether they're federal systems or federal-like systems as we have in the UK, to have underlying parts which don't always agree with each other. In the US at the moment, if you look there, there's discussions around the Supreme Court and people saying, look, does this mean that the union can no longer ultimately hold together in the long term because underlying states within the union can no longer live together? But I take a much more positive attitude to liberal democracy generally and think that we can see these things through. There's a broader point here, which is that if Scotland were to leave the UK and we were to see the UK ultimately break apart, it would be the first time in our lifetimes, not even just my lifetime, but Alex and John's also, in which any of the world's established liberal democracies had decided that they couldn't work out their conflicts internally, that they had to completely go their own separate way. That's not happened in our lifetimes anywhere with an established liberal democracy. It would be a really bad thing for the world as a whole, I believe, if that happened at this critical type period in history when we're seeing a China, which is an anti-democratic, illiberal China, which is going to become potentially the world's most powerful country. When we've got a revanchist, aggressive Russia, which is imperialist again, and we need strong Western democracies to stand firm against that. And when we don't need to see the weakening of NATO, NATO would be fundamentally weakened by the breakup of the UK. The nuclear deterrent would be put at risk. Britain's nuclear deterrent would be put at risk, and that would fundamentally weaken NATO. So there's a bigger picture here, which I think John sometimes tends to kind of miss with all this. So we could argue to the cows come home as to who understands democracy better than anyone else. But all I'm saying is that John and Alex's very narrow, very self-serving, very nationalistic definition of what constitutes democracy is simply an opinion. It is not fact. And to correct something Alex said before, we all know that Scotland is a nation. I'm a proud Scotsman, but it is a simple matter of fact that Scotland is, of course, not a state. That's what you're fighting for. So that's a simple matter of fact. And we have a devolved parliament, which is not a state parliament. It's Scotland's parliament within a state. So that's a simple matter of fact. And another thing we often see with these arguments is that people try to call on people.
I was there at the origins of the Parliament, and it was explicit between myself and the then Secretary of State for Scotland, Donald Dewar, the Labour politician who led the campaign, that nothing in establishing the devolved Parliament, if people expressed the wish for independence, then nobody had the right to stop them. I mean, that was always acknowledged. Even the greatest unionists in our lifetime, Margaret Thatcher, the Tory Prime Minister, the enemy hammer of the Scots, agreed that it was Scots were entitled to leave the Union if they so wished, because they were a nation and nobody should deny it. Now, I find it kind of strange that the Liberal Democrats have now got a narrower definition of Scotland's nationhood than even Margaret Thatcher did. But bring it up to date, can I just point out that the Czech Republic and Slovakia are, as far as I know, democracies. 30 years ago, they decided to go their own way and set up two independent countries. I don't know if John's under 30, but there's an example from within Europe. After an election, incidentally, there wasn't a referendum. They had an election, they voted in different directions, and decided to set up two independent democratic states.
I'll tell you what, though.
They are democracies, and it was decided in democratic fashion. There are members of the European Union in the Baltic states who set up their independent states and subsequently joined the European Union. All that's happened, certainly in my lifetime, and unless you're under 30, John, it happened in your lifetime as well.
I'll tell you what,
John has neither confirmed nor denied his age, but you'll notice that he gave a very, very long answer there. It was a good 2 or 3 minutes, which he talked about the United States, suggested that there was similarity somehow between Louisiana and Texas, and Scotland, and how there was tensions in the States, and talked about the Chinese. But the one thing he didn't answer was how Scotland could leave the Union democratically.
I'll tell you what, gentlemen, we're down to the last Okay, but we're down to the last 4 minutes of this program, and we've talked all about the merits of democracy in this potential vote coming up, and I really actually wanted to talk a little bit more about the practical issues here, because there's a risk potentially that this vote will be similar to Brexit in that many complained that they didn't actually understand the practical consequences of leaving the EU. And as I said, the three main areas with, potential independence for Scotland are trade, travel, and the currency. This is a massive break. I mean, in Brexit, they didn't have to change currency to anything. If Scotland wants to go back to the EU, they're going to have to look at all those measures. Alex, I can ask you, I mean, I know the issues of sovereignty at play here, but tell us, really, if Scotland is fully considering what the economic consequences are going to be when at least 60% of all Scottish exports go to the UK. That's triple what goes to the EU. It's triple what goes really to the rest of the world. Is all of this being taken into consideration?
Well, actually, we're very lucky, Andy. We've got a working example of this at the moment, which John Nicholson briefly alluded to in Northern Ireland. Because of the agreement, which incidentally Boris Johnson is trying to unpick for some reason, best known to himself, that followed the settlement with the European Union, the protocol. Northern Ireland, currently part of the United Kingdom, is part of the single market of Europe, but has an administrative trade border with the rest of the United Kingdom. And lo and behold, what's happened in Northern Ireland, they've had their best relative economic performance compared to the rest of the UK since records began. Because the boom in trade with the single market of 500 million people has overcome any administrative inconvenience with the administrative border. So we've actually got a working example of how it's better to be part of the biggest trading bloc that you wish, either through EFTA, as I would suggest, or the European Union, as John Nicholson suggests. But lastly, I think the major criteria, if you look at world economics just now, what is the biggest thing you need? The biggest thing you need is access to cheap, plentiful, renewable and affordable energy supplies. And there is Scotland has, apart from the talents and abilities of the Scottish nation's people, I would say the access, not just to oil and gas, but the ability to produce 10 times the electricity we require in Scotland, cheap, clean, green, affordable, is an ace card, and why that should be under the control of Scotland and would benefit the Scots. When Scots are suffering from hugely inflated energy bills thudding through their letterboxes, same thing be happening in Turkey at the present moment, then the idea that we've got these resources but can't use them for the benefit of the people is going to be an ace card in the arguments about the economics of independence.
Okay, John Ferry, I can give you 1 minute to respond.
So, Andrea, you're absolutely correct. The big difference between Brexit and what some people might call Skexit, a Scottish exit from the UK, is that the UK is, of course, a full monetary and fiscal union, as well as a free trade area, as well as an economic union in that sense. And the outcome of breaking away overnight from that monetary and fiscal union, as well as implementing trade borders with a trade border with our biggest trading partner, would be so profound and so immense for the people of Scotland and so negative for us that no one in their right mind should be considering doing this at the moment when we've got a cost of living crisis and our health system is in crisis on the back of COVID, and we've got security issues for Western Europe for the first time in generations. The idea of putting us through a self-induced economic crisis in 2025-26, which Alex and John would do, is preposterous. No reasonable person should be thinking about going down that route. If you want to have a constitutional convention to talk about legal routes to secession, great. Let's have it.
Why are you frightened of the debate?
John Ferry, John Nicholson, Alex Salmond, I'm very unfortunately going to have to interrupt it there because we are completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers, but I'm sure we'll be talking plenty more about this in the months coming. So I do thank you so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.